Brian, we've been on a fun journey here talking about how negotiation is decades out of date, is not working, and that essentially when most people are doing negotiation in late stage enterprise sales deals, they're relying on tips and tricks and tiny little like nuances of getting people to come with them on their sales deal or go with them on what they want to sell and how they want to sell it and the price they want to sell it at. But it's not working. They're essentially not planning for the process, and the buyer's going to win every time.
Because they are, by the way, they are reacting to the conversation the customer wants to have, right?
Yeah.
So
they're not leading it.
Yeah.
And in order to lead it, they need to anticipate what's going to happen. They need to have a plan. So in the next episode, we talked about the two things buyers, we know we can predict the buyers are going to do in that negotiation at some point, even 3-6 months down the line. And that gives us our anchor points for how we can plan ahead. But now that we know what those two things are, which is commoditizing the...
I didn't do that. We just had a birthday party.
I have no idea what that was. Never seen that before.
Somebody sent us a gift.
Yeah. I'm just going to keep going then because I don't know what caused that. Things happen like that on Google all the time.
I'm glad you saw it too. I would be troubled if I was the only one that saw the balloons, by the way. So, maybe I need more hydration, something.
Oh, part of me just wants to leave it in there just for funsies. But
I know. Well, it's sort of
like... If I could figure out how to produce it, I would do that more often on purpose.
I actually thought you did that because you're like, it's only two things, like hurrah, ta-da, like that. So.
Oh, man. And because we know what those two things are, which are commoditizing your product and then using that to discount your price or ask for more value, we can actually build a plan accordingly. But my next question is like, well, how do we then build a plan accordingly, knowing that we know what they're going to do ahead of time?
Yeah. So it's good that you keep saying build a plan. We refer to this as negotiation blueprinting. Right. So, and yeah, it's low hanging fruit, but it's that idea that you're not going to start building a house until you have your blueprint in place and you're working according to a plan. So if we know within this high degree of accuracy what's going to happen, then by the way, the most important piece is we need to plan. We need to know more about their alternative than they do. We need to plan to find ways to get that data in front of them during the negotiation. We need to plan. We know we're going to get pressure to give stuff away. So we need a solution for reps that scales, that's repeatable, that coaches can coach against and reps can execute. They don't need 19 effective tips and tricks. One, because they don't work. Two, because it's difficult. Salespeople are too busy. In fact, they're already executing their sales process. They don't need a very complex negotiation methodology on the back end. So since we've defined the problem so narrowly, the solution then is the first thing, no surprise, we need to know more about their alternative. So the first part of blueprinting, to blueprint a deal, you only have to ask and answer 3 questions. And the answers to those questions follow patterns. So after you do them a few times, you get better. Question 1 is, what happens to both sides if you don't agree? Right? It kind of makes sense. If we know the majority of what they're going to be talking about is their alternative to us, we better in advance know more. What is their alternative? What are our strengths and weaknesses, et cetera? The second question is, what does a great deal look like for both sides? And that involves all the moving parts that we need to reach agreement on, not just the one thing that they're putting pressure on us for. If we answer those questions in advance, we're going to be prepared for 97% of the dialogue that comes our way. The third question is, can I prepare 3 paths forward? And we can spend some time on why coming forth with 3 paths versus 1 makes sense. But those are the questions. 97% of the dialogue falls into 2 categories. To get ready, we need to answer 3 questions. And then we've got our negotiation blueprint in place. And we can scale that. We can coach against it. We can measure it.
So when it comes to the first question, what happens to both sides if you don't agree? What are the kinds of things you're looking for in order to answer that question?
Yeah.
Do you just, I mean, you don't get the money, right? And like, is it that simple on your side? Do you need to just figure it out then what's going to happen for the prospect if they don't get it?
That's the most important piece. You mentioned power on another episode, and I had said that your power comes from how well you meet the customer's needs at higher confidence and lower risk than the alternative. The other part it comes from is sales reps assume that, oh my gosh, if I lose this deal, I'm not going to make my number. If I'm not going to make my number, I'm not going to get my bonus. If I don't get my bonus, my kid's not getting her braces, and that's we enter. One of my consultants says all the time that sends us in negotiating scared, because the thing that's readily available in our brain is the pain to us if we lose a deal. And so the first part of the analysis, which is simple, is you're right. If we lose the deal, we lose out on this. However, you might have 7 or 8 other deals backed up, right? Or you might be at 109% of your goal already. So like, who cares? So it helps a little bit to do some analysis on what happens if you lose the deal, because that is what's readily available in people's brain. And sometimes this is a crap deal we shouldn't have gone after in the first place. So guess what? It's not that painful to lose it, because the next one in line is better. So yeah, let's walk. A lot of VP of sales say, I'm helping close a deal that we never should have gone after in the first place. So let's get that out of the way. Let's do a little analysis of Dan's losing the deal. Your kid's probably still going to get her braces, so let's relax. The most important piece is the buyer. And we need to reframe. If you look at the genesis of negotiation, a lot of it comes from game theory. And the two things that came out of game theory, I mean, it was starting for, it was actually helping a scientist play better poker. And then it ended up being used in military strategy. But the thing that most business people use game theory for is decision theory, decision science, and negotiation, which, by the way, sorry for that academic background, but there's a reason why I bring this up. Negotiation and decision making are very similar. Both sides are making a decision to accept or reject a deal. And we love to reframe negotiation out of that old school tips and tricks and say, the buyer primarily is making a decision. So let's answer question 1. What happens to them, right? What does their alternative look like? And the way we do that is quite simple. If they're making a decision, who should be involved, right? What are the relevant stakeholders in that organization at the strategic, the kind of middle level and the operational level? What criteria should they be using when they're putting us side by side with somebody else? That's actually reasonably easy. Most people can do that off the top of their head. Now, if we are going to train your team, we do a little bit of that work up front. Say, okay, when you're selling this solution against this alternative, let me model for you. We call them thought starters. Let me model who should be involved and what criteria they should be using. Here's the criteria they typically miss. Here's where we typically have an edge. This is a reasonably straightforward, less than 1 page thought starter to 6 months out, start thinking through those different buying influences criteria. And then in best case, getting to them early on and having a dialogue with them about, hey, Dan, when you're making this decision, have you thought about? And we start doing what we call signaling early on to change that conversation from same thing.
Yeah,
early
right
on.
from the beginning. These are the other questions you're asking in order
Yes.
to essentially answer your first question of the 3. What
Yes.
happens to both sides if we don't agree?
Yep. And we answer that for ourselves. We should know it better than the customer.
Yeah,
and then we start having dialogue with them. We start leading their decision methodology. Have you thought about these stakeholders? Have you thought about these criteria? We call it signaling because I don't even care if you answer me. I want to get these things in your head. So 6 months from now, when you start saying same thing, I've been like dropping little leaflets of information in your brain over the last 6 months. And that's how we start thinking about negotiation early, is doing that signaling.
So does every company have different signals, or do most of them kind of have like the same general signals that you're trying to drop?
Well, the criteria and the stakeholders are different, right? The method you do that with, it's simply, that's very straightforward. It's saying, hey, Dan, I know a few months from now you're getting ready to put us side by side with someone else. When you make a decision between suppliers, like, are these the typical people that are involved? And how do these criteria stack up for you? Like, how do you typically think of these? Oh, that's interesting. Why do you rack them and stack them that way? That's negotiation, by the way. But it's most people wouldn't define it that way, but that's early on negotiation, beginning to change the conversation. All of that follows a pattern. By the 3rd time you've done this, you've got those signaling questions. By the time you're selling this solution against this competitor, kind of in this vertical over and over again, you're like, I know what to start doing 6 months out.
That's interesting because the way you ask that, like, how do you rank stack what the other solutions on the market? It sounds like you'd essentially get some of your first question answered. What happens if both sides don't agree? Because you can see some of the things that they're looking at that are priorities and what doesn't. I guess you could take some assumptions on what would happen if they don't get those things done.
Yes.
But then you're also answering question two: what does success look like for them? Right, by getting them to rank stack.
Yeah.
So you're answering both questions with some of these. I forgot how you put it. The things that you're asking them.
Yeah, the signaling.
Yeah.
So yeah,
The
yeah.
signals. Yeah.
There's a little bleed over, but I would say that the second question is different and focusing on something else. This is clearly, what does success look like? It is making a holistic decision across multiple stakeholders that gives you the best possible return. And a lot of people think they're negotiating the price of a product. One of the things we're looking at when we're analyzing the other side's decision is at the strategic level, what business metrics are they trying to move? I've worked with somebody who produces microchips, and they're trying to increase yield from wafers. They're trying to reduce defects. That's the discussion we want to be having early on. When you're making a decision between us and these other metrology tools, how important is yield? How important is defect reduction? And changing the conversation from their metrology tool is cheaper, right? And maybe better, to early on beginning to change. People buy stuff to have business impact in their organization. And we need to start having them make a decision that chooses the supplier who best moves the metrics in their organization. So that is question one. Question two, which you were alluding to, is what makes it a great deal for both sides. Very often deals are brought down to one variable. It could be price or something else. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that variable is not set in a vacuum. And so we need to anticipate they're going to put pressure on concessions, which is a zero sum, one item. Here's another rule. So the most important thing is knowing more about the other side's alternative. The second rule, which gets to the second question, is never ever negotiate one thing. And the reason is that's a zero sum game. If you and I are fighting over price, we're moving money from your wallet to my wallet and vice versa. Nothing's happening in terms of creating more value. We're just simply shifting value. But as soon as I say, Dan, there could be a pathway to that. Can we expand this to 12 months versus 6 months? Can we go from 2,000 to 3,000 in volume? We're starting to trade. So by answering question two, we say in a great deal for both sides, what are all the commercial terms for both sides? And how does both sides rack and stack those commercial terms? So now we've already thought through this. We can answer the question about how are we better than their alternative. We can anticipate this concession pressure. And instead of like having an arrow come in and hit us at the last moment, we're saying, I've already thought about that. And the response is, yeah, Dan, there might be a pathway to that. I mean, you already know where the pressure is going to come from. Yeah. Why deal teams are surprised in the 11th hour. We do a lot of end of quarter deal coaching. And you should be surprised when the customer comes back and says, you know what, Dan, you're so much better than your competitor. You probably should be raising your prices. But that's the only surprise. But we see very seasoned people get surprised that, oh my gosh, your competitor is at least as good as you, and they just came in and undercut you on price, and everybody's panicking. We should have been thinking about that 6 months ago. I can already tell you that's going to happen.
So before we go to the pathways one, which I'm really curious to unpack that more.
Yeah.
I think it's like the light bulbs are clicking on in my head and I'm seeing it. I'm like, oh my gosh, like the first question's really setting up what's the pain they're trying to get away from.
Yeah.
And you're trying to make that like real and visceral. Like what are we trying to get away from here? What happens if this doesn't go through? What pain or hell do you keep living in?
Yeah.
Right. And the more real you can make that, the more the setup for the next question of what does success look like? What does that dream outcome look like? Because then you have a large gap and it's very real between the two, right? Which is where all value comes from, is the gap between the pain we're trying to run from and the dream outcome we're trying to get to, right? And I'm guessing the pathways, you're trying to build a bridge between the pain and the gain.
Yeah, you're right. And the one piece I would add to that is often missed in that dialogue is, how do I do that better than the alternative? That's the value. That's the value, is the 2 or 3 ways why you versus that alternative. It's not, and that's where a lot of people make the mistake. It's like, well, here's all of our value drivers to help you with, increasing yield and reducing defects. Well, everybody else has that. So you've got to
So do you,
net it out to what are the 2 or 3 reasons why you on this deal. And by the way, a lot of customers we work with are pretty similar to their competitors. But if you do this analysis better, and I'm talking to you about specific stakeholders and specific criteria where we're going to help you meet your metrics better than somebody else, I'm going to win based on perceived value. If someone else is in there just doing a pitch, but I'm calling out for you, here's the 2 or 3 reasons. Here's things you're trying to get done in your organization. Let me directly connect what I'm doing to those things.
yep. Yep.
Even if they're similar, you're going to win.
Because you're painting a better picture of
Yes.
the,
Yeah.
I guess, all value. And I get this from Alex Hermosi, who's kind of a marketer, entrepreneur dude, but he's like, perceived likelihood of success is massive value.
Yes.
Because if you can know that you're going to get them successful, but if they don't believe it,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter how good you are at getting them successful,
Yeah.
which is why all the credibility indicators of certified X or case studies Y or proven methodology Z, it's like all those things just help them believe.
Yes.
But you as a seller need to be doing that in the sales process, because maybe marketing's doing their thing in order to do that. But you as a seller can be adding on a ton in the sales process
Yep.
by helping them build the pathways or helping them believe more better than your competitors are doing.
Yeah, and something that comes to mind. So we're talking about simplicity. 97% of stuff falls into 2 categories. You only have to answer 3 questions to get it there. And I will make it even simpler from having done a ton of deal coaching. If you're coaching an early stage deal using some selling methodology, I'm worried about who are all the buyers. What is their decision process? What are the criteria? What are all the moving parts? When we start moving to late stage, it comes down to these 1 or 2 influences and 1 or 2 criteria that are really important to the people who matter. Same thing on commercial terms. It's not the 12 commercial terms you need to agree on. There's 3 where there's going to be heat. So we net this out. That's what we've got to figure out as we get closer to the actual, what people would call the negotiation. I would say it's starting 6 months out by doing signaling. But when you're across the table or across the Zoom from somebody, knowing that we've got to net out, what are the 2 or 3 things that are going to make a difference in this deal, right? That's where people miss a lot, is they don't figure that out. It's this person, it's this criteria, and these commercial terms, they're getting beat up on internally, so we have to get ready to address those. It's actually much simpler. Even that part is actually much simpler.
So the 3 pathways, make that a little clearer for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, are there 3 distinct pathways you always take, or are you trying to find 3 pathways there every time? And are they 3 pathways from the pain to the gain, or are they pathways for you to navigate the deal?
All right. Let me. I want to tell you a quick story. So I had mentioned being in partnership with Max Bazerman, this Harvard negotiation professor, and he's pretty good at this. And so, I have an MBA, but I grew up in the South Side of Chicago, and sort of still carry that mindset with me. My dad ran a tavern. My mom was a housekeeper, and Max and I had been in business for a year, and I looked at our results at the end of the year and looked at our profit split and thought, I'm not really crazy. It wasn't terrible, but I'm like, I'm not crazy about this deal I negotiated. And what a surprise that Max out negotiated me on the first year agreement. So I went up and I had lunch with him and kind of explained what was happening. And well, I didn't actually. I talked about everything under the sun because I was too intimidated to negotiate with this guy. Keep in mind, I was still a rookie negotiation consultant. And Max, typical professor, baggy clothes, beard, I said to him, all right, Max, I'm not making enough money here. And he kind of rocked back and stroked his beard a little bit. And he said, so you want some of mine? And so I broke that cardinal rule of never negotiate one thing. Right. So as long as we were talking about money, we were just shifting wallet, contents back and forth. So Max said, how about we restructure our agreement? I'll keep this simple. Maybe the equity changes. There's one where you take more equity and get less cash flow. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I came here looking for money. And he said, but here's another one where you get more cash flow and shift a little equity this way. And so he gave me 3 of these options. There was a third variable in there. I couldn't decide which one. I couldn't do the math in my head quickly enough. And Max said to me, and all right, so, and in fact, I quote, he said, all right, I'll tell you, don't choose any one of these. Which offends you least of these 3 offers I just gave you? And I was like, believe it or not, the one where I take less cash flow and more equity. And he said to me, so you value long-term equity more than short-term cash flow? And I said, yes, I do. And I didn't know that until you just played this little game with me. So this is what Harvard called mesos. We call them multiple solution options. When we give one offer to a customer, let me go back to street level. It's the price of our product. And what the natural psychology of the human is, I want that thing at a lower price. We've been doing this for millennia, right? Everybody knows, give me that at a lower price. If I come in and say to you, Dan, I have 3 paths forward at 3 different effectiveness and investment levels, and they're all tied to moving the business metrics, back to the idea of we're going to increase throughput, we're going to reduce defects for you at different levels among these 3 solutions. You and I are having a radically different discussion about the value and to you of the business output of 3 going forward solutions. Typically, none of those 3 are taken because people can't do the math quickly enough. So that's when I say, okay, rack and stack these for me, Dan. What's most to least, desirable for you of these 3? And then you and I will co-create the 4th. That's a radically different discussion than here's my proposal and my price, which is going to be, yes, I want that at a lower price.
Yeah. Man, that is so different from what most companies are doing, which is like, oh, here's our tiered packages. Which one would you like?
Such a great point.
You know, because you've already asked them what pain looks like, what the outcome looks like.
Yeah.
You know what you want internally. And maybe you're even putting some of those cards on the table, but like, well, here's what would look like success for us. And then you offer essentially three different offerings, same product, same service, but 3 different ways of structuring said product and service financially, what you're giving, how to give it.
Yep.
In order for them to kind of like at least have 3 choices to pick from, which gives them a little, it lets them, we talk about this even in parenting, right? Like to give back some of the choice power makes them feel like they're in control. I do it with my toddler, right? Would you like to go home or would you like to play for 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
I've just given them a choice. It makes them feel like they're in control. So when I actually like 5 minutes from now, I'll be like, okay, those 5 minutes are over. I get way more buy-in to it because I gave them the power. Right?
It's so funny you say that.
At a toddler level, it works, but like we're essentially kind of doing the same thing, but we're doing it in such a way that's customized. Based on the conversations we've been having.
It is customized. It's not good, better, best. It's not the 3 fruit baskets that you offer to everybody. They're slightly customized. And the most important piece of this is if we're going to change that conversation, it's the branding or the titles of these. Like if I'm presenting to you to keep my analogy of working with this semiconductor manufacturer, Dan, I have 3 different relationships we can have at 3 different throughput numbers and 3 different defect reduction numbers. And here are the products and services in number 1, the product services in number 2, the product services in number 3. And here are the terms and conditions associated with these. And it so changes the conversation. And you're exactly right, by the way, that I've done the same with teenagers who wanted to go to skateboard camp. Okay, you got 3 choices. Like, here's where I pay for it, but then you have to do these other things. And you make the call and then end up, again, co-creating the 4th. It is, they're not that tricky to do. And again, you're just focusing on the 2 or 3 key decision criteria, usually the 2 to 4 commercial terms where most pressure is. And then you can come back and backfill the rest of the boilerplate terms and conditions and stuff that go in there. But it's changing that conversation. And now we're co-creating. And I really do like this because now you and I are making a decision together. We're co-creating that 4th. And it's a radical shift. I will not go into almost any deal without, even in personal deals. And as you point out, at home without 2 or 3 choices.
Well, this has been a masterclass in learning how to get to the point because it's a lot of front work, which I'm hoping to cover more in the next episode. Like what should that process look like? The discovery call, the next call, and then the call after that. Like, what does it look like to set this all up? But you're starting to paint a clear picture of what negotiation strategy should look like. When you talk about what doesn't work, when the 2 things we know they're going to do, the 3 questions we need to ask, when we start to put all these puzzle pieces together, we have a really nice looking picture that's going to look really great to your CEO and your board and your shareholders, right?
Yeah. So what I'd like to hit at a street level just before we close is imagine the coaching for this. If this thing scales, so if this is a huge deal that's a year-long deal cycle, you might be answering those 2 questions or those 3 questions over 3 months with 3 or 4 people in the room. But imagine we've got a deal coming up 2 days from now and we sit down and you're coaching me. You're just going to ask me, hey, Brian, what happens to both sides if you don't agree? Give me your best whatever you can answer right now. What is a great deal? Let's expand this. What does a great deal look like for both sides? And let's talk about 3 paths forward. We can do that in 10 minutes, or we can do it in 6 months, depending on the sales cycle of the deal and the size of it. So it expands and contracts. That we want scalability, we want repeatability if we're going to have business impact by investing in our team for negotiation. And we've got to have something that the reps can do and the managers can coach simply because they just have too many other moving parts in their lives.
So good. So if you liked what we're putting down so far, stay tuned for the next episode where we're going to be talking about how to lay this out in a typical deal cycle.